Hey, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. Welcome back. Alexander Stephens is one of two Georgians memorialized in Statuary Hall at the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. There's been some talk recently of the state of Georgia withdrawing Stephens' statue, replacing it with another Georgian yet to be named. The other Georgian who's memorialized there is Crawford Long, the father of anesthesia. Long's statue was placed there in 1926. Stephens in 1927, 94 years ago, and it was carved by Goodson Borglum. You may remember him. We talked about him in an earlier dispatch as the man who began the carving on Stone Mountain, went on to do the carving at Mount Rushmore. Stephens had a long and varied career, not only in Georgia, but on the national stage, and is most famous as the Vice President of the Confederacy. He was born February 11, 1812, 209 years ago, near Crawfordville in Tolliver County. He was orphaned at the age of 14. Stephens was a very slight, small man who never quite developed completely physically, but had a towering intellect. He graduated from the University of Georgia at the age of 20. 2 years later, he passed the bar and became a lawyer and began a long legal and political career. He was first elected to the Georgia State Legislature in the House in 1836, where he served for 7 years. Then in 1843, elected to the U.S. Congress, where he served with former President John Quincy Adams, and also got to know another congressman elected in the 1840s, Abraham Lincoln. They became good friends. Now, Stephens was there from 1843 to 1859 in a very momentous and crowded period of events, controversial events, leading up to the American Civil War. He was there for the Mexican War, for the Compromise of 1850, for the debates over the extension of slavery and the Kansas-Nebraska Acts, the debates over popular sovereignty, the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision, all the way through the John Brown raid in 1859. Stephens was a very staunch supporter of slavery, but a very reluctant secessionist. When his former colleague, Abraham Lincoln, was elected president in November 1860, Stephens cautioned fellow Southerners that Lincoln had done nothing more radical than win an election, that they should wait and see what happened after Lincoln was inaugurated in March of 1861. But when South Carolina went out of the Union in December 1860, Georgians met in January 1861 to debate leaving the Union as well. Alexander Stephens was there and again cautioned his fellow Georgians. He said that secession should be a measure of last resort, that it was absolutely an act of revolution, that President Lincoln would be justified in marching the U.S. Army into the American South, not only to put down what he saw as a rebellion against the authority of the United States, but would probably end slavery as well as a war measure, making the secessionist, he said, the most practical abolitionist of all. And that is, of course, exactly what ended up happening. Now, just a few weeks after Georgia seceded, much to his horror and chagrin, Alexander Stephens was elected vice president of the new Confederate States of America, along with President Jefferson Davis. They were both inaugurated on Washington's birthday, February 22nd, 1861, 160 years ago this month. At first, Davis brought Stephens into the inner circle of the Confederacy, and they were close in policy making, but as Davis became more consumed with military affairs, Stephens withdrew. He was not a military man and eventually became one of Davis's most staunch opponents. There were no political parties in the Confederacy, but as Davis began pushing more nationalistic policies, Stephens remained a staunch states' righter. On March 21st, 1861, Stephens came to Savannah and gave what became a very famous and infamous speech at the Savannah Theater about the origins and the purpose of this new Confederacy. And he told his audience, and I quote, "Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." Unquote. This became famously known as the Cornerstone speech, was met with thunderous applause. Now, Stephens served all the way through the Civil War. He met Lincoln in a failed peace negotiation in Hampton Roads in 1865. He was arrested by U.S. authorities after the war and placed under arrest at Fort Warren in Boston Harbor, where he stayed for 5 months. He was released and came back to Georgia, and the people of Georgia reelected him instantly to the U.S. Congress, this time as a senator in 1866. Now, Congress can decide on who it wants to allow as members in its own body, and they rejected Alexander Stephens, appalled that the people of Georgia would send the second in command of the Confederacy back to Congress less than a year after the Civil War ended. Stephens came back to Georgia and worked on his monumental 2-volume constitutional history of what he called the late war between the states, fully bought into the whole lost cause narrative that slavery did not cause the Civil War, despite his Cornerstone speech. After Reconstruction, for all intents and purposes, ended in Georgia, Stephens was reelected to the U.S. House in 1873, where he served for 9 more years before the people of Georgia elected him governor in 1882. He served for just a few months before he died on March 4th, 1883, at the age of 71. He is buried in the front yard of his home, Liberty Hall, in Crawfordville, which eventually became a state park. And 22 years later, the state of Georgia honored Stephens with Stephens County, and as I mentioned, in 1927, sent his statue to Statuary Hall at the U.S. Capitol. It remains to be seen whether it will remain there. One other shout out this week to an 8th grader that I had the pleasure to meet last week when I spoke to him and to his classmates at Georgia Military Academy. Caden Lloyd is an 8th grader there. Caden, you're already a good historian, and I know one day you're going to be a great one. I look forward to learning from you when I watch your videos and read what you have to say about history. Keep up the good work, Caden. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for watching.